only one drive for Lacan. This is the death drive, and this is associated with jouissance, the pleasure of pain, or pleasure in pain, the enjoyment we attain through pain or within pain. All right? Now, in the later seminars, Lacan would distinguish between enjoyment and jouissance. Right? And so the ethics of psychoanalysis would become how can we, given that jouissance is linked to Freud's death drive, right, how can we retain some little bit of pleasure which is separate from jouissance? How can we attain this? Now, according to Stavrakakis, according to Russell Brigg, these two different conceptions of ethics within Lacanian work are completely incompatible. Right? You cannot maintain the early ethics of Seminar 7 with the later ethics of the drive. Zizek's response to this is straightforward and very, very blunt. Yes, you can. You know, he's not misreading Lacan, they're misreading Lacan, he knows what he's doing. He can have these things together. And this is what I said earlier about Zizek being something of a bricoleur, putting together pieces. It doesn't seem to matter to Zizek whether or not there is, in some sense, theoretical consistency to the different bits that he uses. You know, he just sort of puts all these different pieces together. What is clear from these exchanges, though, is that although Zizek has probably done more than any other theorist of recent years to reorientate our reading of Lacan, today the influence of Zizek's Lacan within the Academy and Lacanian's Lacan is now highly contested in the Anglo-American Academy. Indeed, while Zizek is still viewed as a great popularizer of Lacanian psychoanalysis through the early texts I mentioned, he actually returns to a very limited number of reference points and seminars out of Lacan's total work. Thus, his Lacanian critics argue it would be a mistake if we were to take Zizek's reading of Lacan as Lacan himself. Right? So there's quite an attempt now by clinicians to sort of retrieve our reading of Lacan back for a more sort of clinical psychoanalytic reading and away from this cultural reading that Zizek has. Let me give you another example of this to try and highlight what it is that I'm saying. In the volume I mentioned a little bit earlier, Lacan, The Silent Partners, I think it's arguable that this book that Zizek has recently brought out has very little to do with Lacan at all. As one reads through the volume, there is a certain sense of déjà vu. We seem to return to the same concepts or motifs over and over again. The gap, the non-sexual relation, the subject as substance, truth as contradiction, the symptom, jouissance and guilt, the four discourses, the big other. One also notes the repetition of certain examples. Themes and objects of study recur over and over again, such as opera, the structure of comedy and tragedy. The same film examples are used. Indeed, in some of the essays in this volume, you not only have the same film examples, okay, but they're immediately followed by the same film examples again. So you have people writing about, for example, Ernst Lubitsch's 1942 comedy about the Nazis, To Be or Not to Be. We have the same example of this film in two essays, and in the same two essays, both these examples are immediately followed by the example of Chaplin. Right? So there is a certain repetition going on here. There are the same set of references to Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. I mean, Hegel's phenomenology is huge, and yet we have the same paragraphs repeated over and over again. Or the work of Eric Sattner. The hidden Lacan, it turns out, looks very much like Zizek's Lacan. And we seem to find him in some of Zizek's favourite places. For instance, let me give you a quote here. When we read the Hegelian answer to the false choice of capitalism as not the choice between a Big Mac and a quarter pounder, but rather the choice as the act that alters a symbolic order giving shape to reality itself, this could be Zizek. This is not Zizek, this is someone else writing, but this is one of Zizek's own examples that he uses. Without sort of detracting from the quality of any of these essays, the hidden Lacan turns out to be very much the hidden Zizek. Or to put it another way, Lacan, the Silent Partners, is much more of an extension of Zizekian studies than any instigation of Lacanian paranoia, as Zizek himself claims. And this sort of ties with that point I was making earlier about this attempt to read Zizek as if everything comes from him. Okay? And this is not a problem with Zizek as such, this is a problem with the way we, in the Anglo-American Academy, are reading him, are using him. Right? As if everything begins with him. We're not going back to Lacan, we're not going back to Freud, we're not going back to German idealism, we're not going back to any kind of political theory. We're just reading Zizek as if all the answers are there. And I think this is a problem. Okay, let me return to Zizek's Politics of the Act. Sarah Kay reads Zizek's proliferation of texts and constant return to the same themes and intellectual antagonists as a continual process of self-clarification and self-correction. So, for example, Zizek's long-running exchange with Judith Butler has facilitated a refinement of the notions of castration and the fundamental fantasy. And his more recent endorsement of the work of Alain Badiou has allowed him once again to clarify what he means by the political act. The problem with this reading, with reading Zizek this way, is that it suggests a more coherent and consistent project than is perhaps the case. It suggests, for example, that behind all the jokes and digressions, there is a coherent theoretical system being elaborated, if only one reads carefully enough. Ian Parker, I think, is right, and for me, the best of these introductions, I think, is Ian Parker's introduction for Pluto Press. And I will declare an interest. Ian Parker is a friend of mine. So it's not just that he's a friend of mine. I do think it's the best introduction, particularly as it sort of enters into the kind of spirit of the Zizekian discourse much more than any of the other introductions do. Ian Parker is right, I think, to argue that this is a fundamental misreading of Zizek. A misreading that most of us have been making for years. Zizek is an intellectual provocateur, an incisive critic of the ideology of advanced capitalism, but I'm not convinced that he has a coherent analysis of the contemporary world order or how we might respond to that system today. Or, as Frederick Jameson puts it in a review of the parallax view, that it all adds up to anything at the end of the day. Zizek, in certain interviews, sees himself as a critic. All right? He's a critic of capitalism, he's a critic of the current system, but he keeps saying himself, you know, he's not a magician. He doesn't have any rabbits to pull out of the hat. He doesn't have any answers. Now, as a critic of ideology, I think he's great. It's when we start turning to Zizek to look for some kind of political strategy, as people seem to be doing today, that I think things get problematic. The tendency to read Zizek as elaborating a consistent position also has implications for how we read his politics. One of the constant categories of Zizek's political writing has been the notion of the act, as a violent disruption of the status quo that might make it possible to puncture the prevailing ideology and affect political change. As we see Zizek's work develop in the 1990s,